Thank you. I'm talking about science and spirituality, and I'm interested in this partly because I'm a scientist and partly because I'm interested in spiritual practices. I've written 2 books recently about science and spiritual practices. The first is called Science and Spiritual Practices. The second one, perhaps more enigmatically, is called Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work. And there's really a part of the same project. Each book discusses 7 different spiritual practices which have now been studied scientifically. And I think this is the most exciting way in which science and spirituality are coming together at present. Because if you just have a purely theoretical argument, you'll have people who'll say spirituality is all complete nonsense, it's rubbish, it's superstition, on the grounds it's unscientific. And then there are people who did spiritual things, religious people, and so on. But things are much more interesting now than they used to be, because we now have access to spiritual practices from the entire world's traditions. When I was growing up, I'd never heard of yoga or meditation, and now there are millions of people doing yoga and meditation all over the world, far beyond their home in India. We have access to all these different spiritual traditions, and there's also a tremendous upsurge in interest in spirituality at the moment. Although organized religion is declining in Europe and to some extent in North America, the interest in spirituality is accelerating. And it's a remarkable phenomenon of the modern secular world. Partly because there's so much interest in the secular context, there's now been a lot of scientific research. Literally thousands of papers in peer-reviewed journals have studied the effects of religious and spiritual practices on people's health and well-being. The results are unambiguous. Taking part in religious and spiritual practices, generally speaking, makes you happier, healthier, and live longer. The converse, presumably, is also true. Not taking part in them makes you unhappier, unhealthier, and live shorter, which is why I think militant atheism should come with a health warning, because it often detaches people from their traditional religious practices and leaves them nothing in their place. Now, many atheists have now recognized exactly this fact, and the new generation of atheists, people like Sam Harris, are now into spiritual practices. Sam Harris, who's one of the so-called new atheists, is now giving online meditation courses. Alain de Botton, who's one of our leading atheist philosophers in Britain, wrote a book called Religion for Atheists. And he's trying to recover the benefits of religion for people who've left their ancestral religion or that of their parents or grandparents, because he thinks it's so important for people's health and well-being. So this is the situation we're in, and I'm going to talk. I don't have time to talk about all 14 practices I describe in my books, but I'll start with just one of them, which gratitude, which is the simplest to investigate scientifically. Positive psychologists are a school of psychology that's been going on since about 2000 as a kind of official part of academic psychology. And it's about what makes people happy, as opposed to more traditional forms of psychology, which are about what makes people miserable. And so positive psychology has looked at what kinds of situations are people most happy in. And one of the answers is that when they're in a state of flow, it can be dancing, singing, being absorbed in work, having a great conversation. Being in a state of flow is very conducive to happiness. And many spiritual practices produce states of flow. One of the things that positive psychologists did by looking at people who are happy is to find out what kind of characteristics happy people had. And they found that happy people are very often grateful people. The critics then said, well, of course they're grateful. They're grateful because they're happy. So they tried to find out whether they were happy because they were grateful. And they did some simple experiments. One of them involves taking a group of people like this, who divide into 3 groups at random. One group is asked to write a list of hassles and problems they've had in the previous week. The other group just writes a story about something that happened, and the third group writes a list of things for which they feel grateful, good things that have happened, things for which they feel grateful. And the people who simply make a list of things they feel grateful for are measurably happier for days afterwards. The exercise that had the biggest effect in their experiments was what they called the gratitude letter. They asked people to think of someone who'd helped them in their life who they'd never properly thanked or acknowledged. It could be a family member, a teacher, a friend, and write them a letter thanking them. They then went to that person and read them the gratitude letter. People who did that were happier for 2 months afterwards as a result of this simple exercise. Now, all religions encourage gratitude. There are lots of hymns of praise and thanks in the Christian hymn books. All religions have ways of expressing gratitude. And a very traditional way of doing it in many families throughout Europe and in other parts of the world is by giving thanks before meals, saying grace before meals. In a secular society, that's exactly the kind of practice that drifts away. People just give it up or forget about it or pay no attention. So now in most households in Britain, before meals, at least in those households where people still sit down together to eat, there's often an awkward pause before the meal, and someone says, oh, do start, it'll get cold, or something like that. A kind of gap where the grace ought to be. In traditional institutions like Cambridge colleges, there is a long Latin grace. My own college, Clare College, has a long grace before dinner every evening. And although most people probably don't pay much attention or understand the Latin, at least it provides a kind of pause before eating. In my books, I suggest simple exercises anyone can do. And one very simple exercise of gratitude is to pause before a meal. At home, what we do is hold hands. So we have a short period when we're linked together in a circle around the table, and people can give thanks in their own way. Or someone says a grace, usually me, or we sing a grace. It makes a big difference to have that beginning to a meal, and if it's done silently by holding hands, even if some people there are atheists or even militant atheists, holding hands isn't challenging anyone's belief system, it's simply providing a space for gratitude. Keeping notes of a gratitude journal is another very good way of make daily or weekly accounts of things you're grateful for, counting your blessings. Very old-fashioned thing to do, but very effective. It's so effective that in America, where any new opportunity for making profit is seized on immediately, you can now buy expensive, beautifully produced gratitude journals from gift shops to write your lists of gratitude, things you're grateful in. But you don't need to buy a gratitude journal. You can do it on scrap paper on your telephone or on your computer, or just make a mental note. Anyway, gratitude is a practice that anyone can adopt very easily, and it makes a big difference. What you're grateful for depends on your belief system. And this is where the difference between believers, non-believers, people who are religious, people who are spiritual but not religious, everyone can agree about the importance of gratitude. But then your belief system affects how far you go. Everyone can agree that we're grateful to the people who cook the food, who make it, who prepare it, the farmers who grow it, the people who distribute it, bring it to our tables. We can be grateful to the whole earth for the soil, the plants, the sunlight that enables these plants to grow. So far, that's uncontroversial. But then you could go further and say you feel grateful for the very source of all life itself, the source of consciousness, the very fact we're alive. And in fact, there's no limit to how far you can go until you come to the ultimate source of everything. You may want to stop short, and of course there isn't time for all this before the average meal. But the belief system comes in not in ruling out gratitude or endorsing it, but in how far you go in your gratitude. Now in meditation we reach a similar situation where lots of people meditate. About 18 million Americans now meditate. Millions of people in Britain meditate. How many people here do or have meditated? Oh well, that's most people. So the research on meditation shows that people who meditate have physiological benefits, lower blood pressure, all sorts of physiological benefits. In the 1970s, when this research began at Harvard, Herbert Benson called the effects of meditation the relaxation response. It's to do with activating the parasympathetic nervous system. As you all know, we have two autonomic nervous systems that work in opposite directions. The sympathetic nervous system has, of course, nothing to do with sympathy. It's mostly to do with fear, fight or flight reactions, adrenaline, higher blood pressure, pumping, accelerated heart rate, and so on. And that's a very appropriate response if you're being attacked by a mad dog or a robber or something. But a lot of people in the modern world are chronically anxious. They're fearful all the time, worrying all the time about things that could be dangers to them. And this chronic anxiety triggers off an excessive activation of the adrenaline system, the sympathetic nervous system, which causes stress, insomnia, and all sorts of other bad effects. The meditation helps to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which is to do with relaxation. It happens when you feel safe, secure, and relaxed. And that's the nervous system that has to be predominant for you to eat, or to go to the lavatory, or to make love. If you're running away from a mad dog, the last thing you think of is sitting down to a delicious meal or making love or even going to the lavatory. The parasympathetic nervous system is important for our normal everyday physiology. One of the things meditation does is activates that and deactivates the sympathetic nervous system. It also affects all sorts of physiological measurements. It affects the activity in the brain, and particularly it leads to a reduction in the activity of the default mode network, the series of brain regions which are associated with the internal dialogue, thinking, worrying, anxiety, fears, fantasies, and so on. And it shuts down gradually as you let go of thoughts through concentrating on the mantra or observing the breathing or sensations in the body. You can gradually let go of attachment to these thoughts, and the default node network is less active. Now, all that everyone agrees about, and there are further studies on meditation, more detailed studies of experienced meditators like Tibetan monks and so on, which reveal there are actual brain changes in the anatomy of the brain caused by long-term meditational practice. Then the question is, the interpretation question comes in now. If you're an atheist and a materialist, or let me just say a materialist, mechanistic materialism, which is still the dominant philosophy in science, is that the universe is unconscious, matter is unconscious, the only reality is matter or physical reality, and consciousness is produced in brains by brain activity. Minds are what brains do is a materialist slogan. Therefore, if you benefit from meditation, if you feel a sense of greater consciousness, connection, it's all inside your head. It's nothing but a change in the neurotransmitter levels or patterns of nervous activity in different regions of the brain. It's inside your head. And you can meditate and you can benefit from it, and you can believe that, and many people do. But the reason meditation developed in Hindu, Buddhist, cultures and in contemplative Christianity, in monasteries and convents, was because people thought that by getting to the very ground of consciousness in our own minds, we connect with the ground of consciousness of the entire universe, that our minds are part of a much greater mind. They're a kind of fractal version of the divine mind, which underlies all reality and all forms of consciousness within the universe. And that meditation is therefore a way of connecting with this greater form of consciousness. A familiar Hindu metaphor is picturing buckets of water which reflect the moon at night. You see the moon reflected in every bucket of water. It looks like lots of separate moons, but actually they're all reflections of one moon in these separate containers. And our own minds are all reflections of an ultimate consciousness that shines through each of us. If you're a religious person, then you can believe that meditation connects you with a greater form of consciousness. And in fact, through meditating, you become more transparent to that greater consciousness, more linked to it. And because ultimate consciousness in all religions is thought of as ultimately blissful, the blissful states you achieve through mystical connection are because of this connection with the divine. So you can interpret the meditation differently depending on your belief system, but you can still meditate whatever you believe. Now, some forms of spiritual practice are more belief specific. Prayer, for example, petitionary prayer, asking for things, depends on believing there's some conscious being you can ask. And all prayers begin with an invocation of a conscious being. Our Father, who art in heaven, Hail Mary, full of grace, Om Namah Shivaya. You start with an invocation to a spiritual being, and then work in almost the opposite direction to meditation. Meditation is like letting go of interest in the outer world. You close your eyes, you sit still. Then letting go of the train of thoughts in your mind till you come to the ground of consciousness itself. It's like breathing in. Petitionary prayers, like the opposite, it's like breathing out. You connect with the source of consciousness, and then you direct your attention and intention to things you're worried about, people you know who are sick, problems in the world, problems in your own life, problems in your family, prayers for protection. Prayers are about practical things, and lots of people pray. But in the modern secular world, fewer people pray than meditate. 150 years ago, it would have been the other way around. I myself think they're complementary practices. I do both. I meditate in the mornings and I pray in the evenings before I go to bed. But prayer does require a belief that there's some point in praying. Very few atheists pray, but many atheists meditate. Religious people or people who are spiritual but not religious pray, but it depends on a belief system. You have to have someone you pray to or some being you pray to. But there are some spiritual practices which I think are not even seen as spiritual practices by most people, but are. In my new book, Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, the first chapter is on sports. And I think that sports in the modern world, in the modern secular world, are probably the most common way in which people enter spiritual states of being. States where they feel that they're part of the flow, they're totally in the present, they're part of something greater than themselves. In meditating, you may find that it takes a long time before the thoughts stop inside your mind, the default mode network shuts down. But in sports, it can happen almost instantaneously. A friend of mine who in America told me at the busiest time of his life, meditation just didn't work for him. His mind was hyperactive. He couldn't sleep at night. He was thinking all the time. But he was also a mountaineer, and he said by the time he was 50 feet up a rock face, he was completely in the present. Last night, I had a conversation with the world free highline champion, Friedrich Kuhn. He's German. And he walks on kind of tightrope high lines over 1,000-foot drops over waterfalls, where one slip and he'd be instantly dead. And I had a most interesting conversation with him. I said, he said it was addictive. And he found this the most thrilling thing in his life, because when he was doing it, he was completely in the present. He wasn't even thinking about what happened 2 footsteps back along the thing. Totally in the present, and he said that feeling was totally blissful. And the point of doing it without a safety harness is that he got even more into the present that way, because if a safety harness, he said he'd sometimes get a bit blasé. If he slipped, he wouldn't drop to his death. I think that's why extreme sports are a feature of modern secular societies. I mean, I lived for 7 years in India, and I worked in agricultural research there, and I met a lot of very poor people living in villages. A lot of people in Indian villages live quite close to death. There's a lot of infant mortality, there are epidemics, a lot of women die in childbirth, people can be murdered by bandits. There's lots of reasons why people are close to death. The last thing they'd like to do is sort of climb up mountains without ropes or go on tight ropes over waterfalls. They're experienced at living near to death. And most traditional peoples are. I think, however, in our culture, where we have the National Health Service, we have health and safety regulations framing every aspect of our life. We have risk-averse practices everywhere. We have liability litigation. It's interesting that in this context of reduction of risk to the maximum possible degree, as the opposite side of the coin are these extreme sports. People skydiving, free diving, free climbing, free highlining, so many really dangerous sports. Even skiing and snowboarding are basically very dangerous sports. Driving motorbikes very fast is very dangerous, the thrill of speed. There are many sports which are extremely dangerous, and I think they're attractive to people precisely because they force them to come into the present very quickly in a way that even the most effective spiritual practices don't work quite as fast. So also, of course, in team games, you have the feeling of going beyond yourself, being part of a team, something greater than yourself with a shared goal. And so I think that actually there's many sports people privately acknowledge the spiritual dimension, but it's not part of the public persona of sports at all. And yet I think it is one of the most important spiritual practices in modern secular societies without even being recognized as such. Fasting is another practice found in all religious traditions. The physiology of fasting is actually regenerative and rejuvenating. So there are many physiological benefits, but these ketone bodies are also psychoactive. Beta-hydroxybutyrate is very similar to gamma-aminobutyric acid, GABA, one of the main neurotransmitters in the brain, and very similar to gamma-hydroxybutyrate, GHB, which is a street drug sold for its euphoric effects, which is a natural neurotransmitter. And people who are fasting find very often their minds become clearer, they have more vivid dreams, and the day becomes surprisingly longer because all the time, well, it's not surprising when you think about it, all the time you spend eating or preparing food is free time. How many people here have fasted for more than a day or two? Well, that's quite a lot. So, I mean, if you've done it, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't done it, it's a spiritual practice, or you might, if you don't want to think of it as spiritual, but just as health-related, you can do it for that reason alone. But I find it works best to do it for both reasons, spiritual and health. Kill two birds with one stone. So here's a spiritual practice which I think is immensely beneficial. And if the National Health Service rolled out fasting counsellors and encouraged fasting in the population, I think medical bills would drop, life expectancy and general health would increase dramatically at no cost, apart from the training of the fasting counsellors. In fact, fasting actually saves you money because you don't have to buy the food. If you feel that you need to spend money to believe something works, you can go to a health farm and pay several £1,000s to eat nothing. But I do it at home. One of the other subjects I touch on, I have a chapter on in my book, is spiritual openings through psychedelics. I myself think that in the modern world, where people are brought up in a secular materialist society with a materialist scientific educational system that gives people the impression that minds are nothing but brains, the universe is unconscious, and so on, taking psychedelics is often like a rite of passage for young people, giving a sense of realms of consciousness way beyond anything they'd imagined. That was certainly my own experience. When I first took LSD in 1970 or 71, I was a junior don at Cambridge at the time. And it was not part of my expectation or worldview that there'd be realms of consciousness way beyond anything I'd imagined. I had a kind of near-death experience, which apparently many people on LSD do. This kind of feeling of drowning, being compressed, and I felt I was completely trapped, and then escaping like through a tunnel of light, coming into the light. It was like coming up to the surface, bursting out through the surface of water into a state of total bliss. I myself think that rites of passage in general, in all cultures, either symbolically or actually induce near-death experiences. As I discuss in my book, Science and Spiritual Practices, I think that the most familiar one in our own tradition is baptism. I think when John the Baptist, as described in the Bible, was baptizing people on an industrial scale. They were flocking from all over the Holy Land, and he was holding them under in the River Jordan. And when they came out, their lives were changed. I think he was a drowner. And I think he held them under just long enough to induce a near-death experience by drowning. I mean, the traditional view is that it was just symbolic, and that he was symbolic of death by drowning. But why have something symbolic when you can have the real thing? It only takes a couple of minutes longer. And, I mean, he could have lost a few, but that was before litigation. And I myself think that in the 16th century, in the ferment of the Protestant Reformation, when the most extreme Protestant reformers, who were the Anabaptists, got going, they went back to the ancient practice. Most Christians stopped soon after the time of Christ and had infant baptism by sprinkling water or by immersion briefly of infants. I think the Anabaptists, when they read the Bible, they said, let's start doing that again. And they did. And they went round saying they'd died, they'd seen the light, and they'd been born again. Exactly what you'd expect if they'd had a near-death experience induced through drowning. And so I think that, in fact, in the most radical forms of Christianity, that was indeed what was going on. And it's the Baptists in America today who still have total immersion baptisms. I doubt if they do it for long enough to get into trouble with possible litigation and so on. But they're the ones who talk about dying and seeing the light and being born again. I think for them it was a literal experience. And I think that for many young people, something like that is happening through psychedelics. There are many other practices I haven't talked about. Pilgrimage is one that's undergoing a remarkable revival in Britain. Singing and chanting are a spiritual practice anyone can do, a part of all religions. My wife, Jill Peirce, has been leading wonderful workshops on this for decades. There are many other practices. Connecting with nature is one of the very important ones. So there are a lot of holy days and festivals. There are many other spiritual practices. But the point I'm trying to make is that anyone can do these. You don't have to be religious. I myself am. I'm an Anglican and I go to church. I have a framework that works for me within which I do these practices, but I've been through atheist phases, Hindu phases, Sufi phases, and so on. For me, it works to have a religious framework. For some people, it doesn't. But the point here is not that you have to have a religious framework, but that these practices are available to everybody, and that most of them have life-enhancing effects. So in my books, I suggest 2 simple exercises for each of these practices whereby you can try them for yourself. And I think we're at the beginning of a whole new phase of spiritual evolution right now. It's unprecedented in human history, and I'm actually very optimistic about it. And so that's the note I'd like to end on.